Amos 9 and verse 9, the Sieve. Today, let's continue our series on rebuilding the Tabernacle of David with an in-depth look at Amos chapter 9 and verse 9. And we're filming today in the bomb shelter surrounded by Bibles. So, verse 9 in the King James Version, "For lo, I will command, and I will sift the house of Israel among all nations, like as corn is sifted in a sieve, yet shall not the least grain fall upon the earth." And I put air quotes there for corn because it's implied. The King James writes it there in italics. That's the way the King James does it every time they fill in a word that they think needs to be added beyond what the original language said in order to make it understandable in English. But the word corn is not there in the Hebrew. That's why King James put it in italics, and that's why I put it in air quotes. So the word corn is not there in the Hebrew, but it's implied, as we see later in the verse, not the least grain would fall upon the earth. It is wheat grain that is sifted in a sieve. So in George Lambsa's version, translated from the Aramaic, he writes wheat because it's implied. And even with the King James Version, we see that the Old English corn really means kernel. And we see this phrase, corn of wheat, in John 12:24. So corn of wheat really means kernel of wheat, and they share some of the same letters. Kernel, K-R-N, corn, C-R-N, but the C has a K sound. Esposito leaves it as one shakes with a sieve, with no guess there as to what specific grain is implied in the text as being shaken with a sieve. The New King James italicized the word grain, so it's implied, which agrees with tzror, tzadik resh, vav resh, which is later in the verse. "For lo, I will command, I will sift Israel," according to the New King James. "I will scatter Israel," according to George Lambsa's translation from the Aramaic into English. "I will shake Israel." That's Don Esposito's translation of the Aramaic in English. So all of these words used, sift, scatter, shake, those are all appropriate. This is what Yahweh Elohim is doing with the house of Israel. He is shaking, sifting, scattering, shaking Israel among all nations. And the Hebrew there reads, Bekol ha-goyim. And that's goyim, not amim, which would be peoples. Goyim is the nations which are not Israel. It is the heathen nations, the pagan nations, which is not a negative word. It is just the word to describe all of the other nations which are not Israel. Israel is separated by Elohim, one nation. All the other nations are called goyim, otherwise known as heathen or pagans. The grain, tzror, in the Hebrew, is the house of Israel, including Judah and Israel together. So the wheat, the grain, is sifted in a sieve, yet not the least grain, tzror, fall upon the earth, which is ground, but in the Hebrew, it's written eretz, aleph resh tzadik tzufit. So that's the same as the land, as in the land of Israel, but of course, in this sense, eretz means the ground, the earth, which is the nations of the world where Yahweh has scattered the children of Israel. So, yet not the least grain would become rooted there in exile, in the galut, in the diaspora, among the other nations outside of Israel. So the purpose of this sifting is to separate the wheat from the chaff, not to replant the wheat in the earth. It's not to resettle the house of Israel among the goyim, among the heathen, among the Gentiles. The Young's literal translation reads, "For lo, I am commanding, and I have shaken among all the nations the house of Israel, as one doth shake with a sieve, and there falleth not a grain to the earth." And Robert Young, the Young literal translation, Robert Young believed in a strictly literal translation. So the verb tense is left as is, rather than interpreting past tense as if it were future tense in the Hebrew prophecies. So sift is to separate. It's a form of sorting. We see in Matthew 5:32, the King James reads, "And before him shall be gathered all nations, and he shall separate them one from another, as a shepherd divideth his sheep from the goats." And in 2 Corinthians 6:17, "Wherefore come out from among them, and be ye separate, saith the Lord, and touch not the unclean, and I will receive you." Similarly, in Hebrews 7:26 in the Aramaic English New Testament, in the discussion about the high priest, which is Yeshua the Messiah, it's written, "For a priest like to him was also suitable for us, one pure and without evil and without stain, one separated from sins and exalted higher than heaven." Yeshua spoke of separating the wheat to his barn, separating the wheat from the chaff, which was to be burned. In Matthew 3:12, in the King James Version, we see, "Whose fan is in his hand, and he will thoroughly purge his floor, and gather his wheat into the garner." And that's singular. The plural is found in the Aramaic version, such as in Lamza, it's written barns, and in the Aramaic New Testament. But in the King James and the New King James, it's barn singular. "But he will burn up the chaff, the straw," Lamza, "with unquenchable fire." Interesting there that in Greek, it's singular barn, but in Aramaic, the Esposito version left it as singular storehouse, while George Lamza and Andrew Gabriel Roth inscribed it as plural barns or storehouses. Matthew 3:12 in the AENT. "He whose winnowing fan is in his hand will cleanse his threshing floors, and will gather to his granaries, and the chaff he will burn in the fire that does not extinguish." Then we get to Matthew 13, the parable of the wheat and the tares, which ends with Matthew 13:30 in the AENT, "Let both grow together until the harvest. And at that time of the harvest I will say to the reapers, to pluck out first the tares, and bind them in bundles to be burned, but the wheat gather them into my storehouses." King James again has it singular barn instead of plural barns, storehouses, because often when the Aramaic has a plural, the Greek scribe often misses it during copying, because in the Aramaic the plural is indicated by just a dot with some words. We see the same plural singular issue in Luke 3:17, garner singular used in the King James Version, but plural granaries in the AENT, translated to English from the Aramaic. So this wheat and the chaff parable is an example of sifting for the purpose of separation. Of course, in the parable, a winnowing fan is used, but in Amos, the prophet, he uses a sieve. So what is this sifting in Amos chapter 9, verse 9? In the times when the first temple was still standing, that temple built by Solomon using the materials gathered by King David, Yahweh proclaimed during that time through the prophet Amos that he would scatter the nation of Israel among the Goy nations, and yet he would not allow Israel to take root there. Not one thror, kernel, would fall to the ground. He would keep these grains separate from the nations. In other words, when he scatters Israel among the nations, he's not done with Israel yet. He still has more to accomplish. He has not turned his back on Israel. When he scatters Israel among the nations, he is not by any stretch planning to replace Israel with a new Israel or with a church, a new people, a new congregation. No, a new tribe. He watches carefully as he sifts Israel, and he very attentively ensures that not one swore grain falls to the ground. Not one grain gets out of his sifter. Not one kernel of wheat escapes from the sieve down to the individual. Yahweh watches every person from the house of Israel, even as in the future, relative to the first temple. He plans to scatter the people of Israel. Not even one individual Israelite will escape his watchful eye. Not even one will remain rooted and settled among the heathen, pagan, Goy, Gentile nations, that is to say, those nations which are not Israel. Yet there is hope for those nations outside of Israel, and we will see that in the upcoming verses. It has been said that in the Tanakh, in the Torah, the prophets, and the writings, also known as the Old, Irrelevant, Outdated Testament, Yahweh deals with the people on a national level, but in the Brit Chadashah, the renewed covenant, also known as the New Improved Replacement Testament, to replace the old one, Yahweh deals with individuals there rather than nations. But this prophecy in the Tanakh, written during the First Temple period, this prophecy proves that Yahweh even then was dealing with individuals and not only collectives, groups of people as tribes and nations. Even then, he was dealing with people both on an individual level as well as on a tribal level. And the same is today, when he continues dealing with people individually, and he continues dealing with people groups as nations and tribes, fulfilling all of his plans, his words, his scripture, his prophecies. So, that is the sieve. Next up, this will bring us to verse 10 and the nature of this sifting. Thank you for following along with us in Amos chapter 9 in our series on the restoration, rebuilding of the Tabernacle of David. If this video has provided value to you, you can show your appreciation by sending a donation of any size that reflects this value to you at jtod.org, the initials for Jerusalem Tabernacle of David.org. And you can share this video with others. And at the very least, you can click subscribe and punch that bell icon so you get notifications of new videos on the jtod.org video channel or our other channels, Yerubilee and Bomb Shelter Bibles. Thanks for your support, and we'll see you in the next video.